Hey there, wanderer of the late-night internet. Before we dive into tonight's quiet chaos of history, tell me something down in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Are you hiding from sleep at 2 a.m.? Or maybe it's a lazy afternoon and you just needed some background melancholy. I love seeing the little constellation of time zones light up. So drop your location and the hour on your clock. Let's see how far this sleepy empire stretches tonight. Settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're dimming the lights, brewing something warm, maybe tea, maybe despair, and floating quietly back to one of history's least fun calendar years. It's called 536 AD, and historians, in their usual restrained academic tone, have lovingly described it as the worst year to be alive. Which, is impressive, considering history has seen a lot of bad years. So let's tuck in. You're lying down. Maybe you're half asleep already. Perfect, because this story starts in the fog, literal apocalyptic fog, that refused to go away. The year without light. In 536, something happened to the sun. No one's entirely sure what, but it wasn't good. People from China to Ireland wrote about it. The sun, they said, lost its power. It was still up there, technically, but it looked wrong. Dim. Like someone had put a gray filter on the sky and refused to turn it off for 18 months. And, of course, because this is the 6th century, no one had the luxury of checking NASA's website for updates. They just looked up, squinted at the weak, ghostly sun, and assumed the world was ending. Which, to be fair, wasn't an unreasonable guess. Scientists today think it was probably a volcanic eruption, maybe two, one in Iceland, one in North America. Together they spat so much ash and sulfur into the stratosphere that sunlight barely made it through. Temperatures dropped, crops failed, and the global economy, what little of it existed, collapsed like a cheap tent in the wind. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote, "The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during the whole year." Which, coming from a man who usually spent his time roasting emperors, is a pretty restrained way of saying we're all going to die. Cold, famine, and the usual collapse. So, with the sun gone and the world in a bad mood, harvests failed from Ireland to China. Grain prices tripled. People started eating bark, grass, and occasionally each other, though we don't have to linger on that. In Ireland, the Annals of Ulster record a failure of bread, which is medieval understatement for everyone starving. In China, summer snow fell. Entire dynasties trembled. The Sui dynasty rose not long after, because if there's one thing cold weather and hunger are good for, it's political upheaval. And Europe? Well, Europe did what it does best, collapse into chaos. The Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy started wobbling like an overbaked flan. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian was in power, and of course he was, because if there's a disaster, Justinian's usually hovering somewhere nearby, trying to build a church about it. Justinian's unlucky decade. Now, Justinian I is one of those emperors who somehow manages to look both impressive and perpetually tired in every mosaic. He's the man behind the Hagia Sophia, the one who tried to resurrect the Roman Empire, and the one whose entire reign was basically a cosmic joke. Because just when the fog finally cleared, surprise, a new guest entered the party. The Justinianic plague, hitting in 541, like a sequel no one wanted. Imagine surviving 18 months of darkness, several years of famine, and then being introduced to the world's first pandemic-level plague. That's the 530s for you. The plague probably started in Egypt, hitching a ride on grain shipments to Constantinople, because, yes, the Byzantines were importing food again after their farms failed. Within a year, it spread across the empire like a medieval chain email. Contemporary accounts say half the population of Constantinople died. That might be an exaggeration, but then again, ancient people were bad at math and sanitation, so maybe not. Procopius described carts carrying corpses to mass graves, dogs eating bodies in the streets, and an emperor who thought he might be next. Justinian himself caught the plague but survived, somehow, though most people probably wished he hadn't, since his tax collectors definitely didn't catch it. The empire that wouldn't die, but maybe should have. After the plague, Justinian decided to keep going with his grand plan to reunite the Roman Empire. Because nothing says good governance like waging 3 simultaneous wars during a pandemic. He sent armies into Italy, North Africa, and Spain, and to everyone's surprise, actually won. Briefly, by the time he died, he'd technically restored Roman borders to something vaguely respectable. But the empire was bankrupt, its cities half empty, and its population halved. Archaeologists can literally see it in the layers of dirt. Whole towns just vanish from the record in the mid-500s. It's the moment Europe slid into what historians call the Dark Ages, though, honestly, they'd been practicing for that label for a while. So, if you were alive in 536 AD, congratulations. You'd have seen the sun die, the crops fail, and your emperor try to rebuild Rome while half the empire coughed itself to death. It was, by all accounts, not a vibe. Floating to the next disaster. Let's drift away from the dust and the coughing crowds of Constantinople now. Take a deep breath. Pretend the air doesn't smell like sulfur and regret. We're moving ahead a few centuries to a different kind of nightmare. Less volcanic, more medieval and messy. Because the next stop on our list of times you really didn't want to be alive takes us to a cold, damp corner of Europe, England, in the 14th century. The fashion was itchy. The politics were confusing. And yes, there was another plague. But before the Black Death arrived, life in England was already sort of a grim endurance test. So, let's talk about what it was like to wake up in the middle of the 1300s, when everything from your diet to your dental situation could politely be described as unfortunate. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you survived part 1, congratulations. You made it through the volcanic fog, the global famine, and Justinian's particularly cursed empire. Now, let's glide a few centuries ahead to the 1300s. The air's still not great, by the way, but at least you can see the sun again. Europe in the 14th century was life. Sort of. Cathedrals were rising, cities were bustling, and people were inventing new and creative ways to tax peasants. The feudal system was doing its thing, nobles sitting comfortably on top, peasants doing all the actual work, and everyone pretending it was a divine arrangement. It's one of those centuries that started off feeling almost optimistic. Trade was booming, universities were popping up, and someone somewhere was probably discovering that washing your hands occasionally might not be the worst idea. And then, because history is allergic to nice things, the Black Death arrived. Before the plague, the warm-up act of misery. Let's not rush straight into the pandemic, though. Before the Black Death wiped out a third of Europe, things were already spiraling nicely. In the early 1300s, Europe got hit by what's charmingly known as the Great Famine. It started in 1315, when the weather decided it had had enough of everyone's nonsense and just stopped cooperating. It rained for 2 years straight. Crops rotted in the fields, animals drowned in mud, and people realized that eating bread made of actual grain was now a luxury experience. Chroniclers wrote that people were eating cats, dogs, and, well, things you probably shouldn't eat. Mothers abandoned children. Priests stole from the dead. And because there's always someone trying to spin disaster into divine meaning, preachers said it was God's punishment for sin, which, to be fair, was the go-to explanation for pretty much everything between 400 and 1700. The famine killed millions. Then, when the rain finally stopped and people started crawling out of their hovels again, they noticed something new on the horizon: war. The 100 Years' War, or when everyone forgot to quit. You know how some conflicts start small and then spiral way out of control? Yeah. The 100 Years' War is that. It kicked off in 1337 between England and France over who got to sit on the French throne. The short version: the English king, Edward III, thought he had a decent claim. The French disagreed. Instead of talking it out like adults, they opted for a century of intermittent chaos, burning villages, and men in tin suits stabbing each other in the rain. It wasn't one long, continuous war. It was more like, fight for a decade, take a nap, repeat. And it's hard to overstate just how miserable this made life for the average person. Armies marching through your field didn't care whose side you were on. They just wanted your chickens. If you were a peasant, your village might be raided 3 times in a single season by 3 different armies, all insisting they were the good guys. And as if famine and war weren't enough, along came the fleas. Enter the Black Death. It started quietly, somewhere around 1346. Reports of a strange illness trickled in from the east, from the steppes, from the ports of the Black Sea. Merchants whispered about a great mortality. Then in 1347, ships arrived in Sicily, carrying what historians would later call Yersinia pestis. But at the time, people just called it the pestilence. It spread faster than anyone thought possible. Within a year, it had reached France, England, and most of mainland Europe. Within 5 years, it had killed somewhere between 25 and 50 million people. That's roughly a third of Europe's entire population. Gone. Life during the plague. Imagine waking up in 1348. You're a peasant somewhere in England. The air smells like wood smoke and fear. Your neighbor was fine yesterday. A little cough, maybe, but today he's covered in dark swellings. Buboes, they called them. Painful, oozing lumps in the armpit or groin. If they burst, you might live. If they didn't, you were dead within 3 days. The towns reeked. The bells never stopped tolling. And since no one understood bacteria or hygiene, people tried all sorts of creative solutions. Some walked through the streets whipping themselves to atone for sin, flagellants, they were called. Others burned aromatic herbs, carried posies, or stuffed vinegar-soaked cloths up their noses. A few blamed the Jews and carried out massacres across Europe, because apparently when people panic, reason is the first casualty. Doctors wore those now famous beaked masks, filled with herbs like lavender and mint. They looked terrifying, but the herbs did precisely nothing, unless the plague happened to be scared of birds. The collapse of everything. As the death toll rose, whole cities emptied. Venice lost 60% of its population. Florence, half. In London, corpses piled up faster than the gravediggers could manage. Priests refused to perform funerals. Families sealed their sick relatives inside their homes and fled. Some towns resorted to pushing carts through the streets, calling out, "Bring out your dead." And yet, in the middle of all this, a strange thing happened. Society kept limping on. Markets still opened, occasionally. Kings still issued decrees. And peasants, the ones who survived, suddenly found themselves in demand. Because with so many dead, there weren't enough laborers to work the fields. Wages went up. Serfdom, that ancient institution of unpaid suffering, started to wobble. It's darkly ironic, but the plague, for all its horror, ended up shaking the social order loose. People began asking questions like, "Wait, why exactly am I working for free again?" Which, in the medieval world, was basically a revolutionary thought. Royal problems. Of course, while peasants were dying and occasionally negotiating better pay, kings were having meltdowns. In France, King Philip VI tried to act like he had everything under control, but his treasury was collapsing, his army was demoralized, and his hairline was probably retreating in sympathy. In England, Edward III kept fighting France anyway. Because really, why not? The plague killed half his soldiers, but he just raised taxes and kept going. He also lost his son, the legendary Black Prince, whose name sounds impressive but whose career was mostly a long series of exhausted victories and painful illnesses. By the end, even the royal family couldn't escape the mortality that seemed to stalk the entire continent. And in the background, the Church, Europe's supposed spiritual bedrock, was cracking under the weight of all that death. When the Church lost its halo, the Church had no answers. Priests died just as quickly as anyone else. And when the Pope himself, Clement VI, decided to hide inside his palace at Avignon, surrounded by fires to purify the air, people started asking questions. Faith wavered, pilgrimages dried up, and new, strange movements emerged. Mystical sects, prophets claiming divine visions, even apocalyptic cults convinced the end was finally here. One monk in Germany wrote that he'd seen rivers of fire in the sky. Another claimed that birds fell dead in flight, as if the air itself were cursed. And honestly, who could blame them for thinking so? The Black Death changed not only Europe's population but its psychology. After you've watched your entire village vanish, normal stops meaning anything. The aftermath, new world, same problems. By the 1350s, the plague began to fade. It didn't vanish. It would keep returning every decade or so for the next 300 years, but the first wave was over. Europe looked empty, fields overgrown, villages abandoned. Historians estimate that it took over 150 years for the population to recover. But in that emptiness, something strange bloomed. With fewer mouths to feed, the survivors were wealthier. Land was cheaper, food more plentiful. Some historians even call it the economic renaissance of the peasantry, which sounds like a cheerful brochure for something that killed 50 million people. Still, it marked the beginning of change, subtle, slow, but unstoppable. The Middle Ages were wobbling toward something new, a world where humans might finally start asking if maybe washing hands and questioning authority weren't such bad ideas after all. Let's drift to another disaster. So, that was the 14th century. Famine, war, plague, and a few accidental revolutions. Europe somehow survived, barely, and crawled into the Renaissance like a hangover victim looking for coffee. But we're not done yet. Because if you thought the Black Death was unpleasant, just wait until you hear about the Little Ice Age, the religious wars, and the endless monarchic tantrums that define the next few centuries. So, take a deep breath, maybe sip some water, and when you're ready, we'll move forward, gently, into the cold, paranoid 1600s, where witch hunts, starvation, and incompetent kings were just part of the daily routine. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations, you've survived volcanic winters, collapsing empires, famine, and plague. Now, let's add a few centuries of bad weather and religious anxiety to the mix. We're floating softly into the 17th century, a time of cold mornings, colder politics, and royals who couldn't make a single good decision without starting a war. The period we're talking about, roughly between the 1300s and the 1800s, is called the Little Ice Age. Historians don't entirely agree on why it happened. Maybe volcanic eruptions again, maybe sunspots, maybe just the universe's way of saying, you people need to calm down. But whatever caused it, temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped noticeably. Winters grew longer, summers shorter, crops failed more often, rivers froze, including the Thames in London, which, charmingly, people turned into a festival ground, because if the world gives you a frozen river, you might as well sell roasted chestnuts on it. But beneath all that picturesque frost lay a century of panic, starvation, and kings who made everything worse. When weather became a problem, you might not think a few degrees colder sounds catastrophic, but in a pre-industrial world, it was basically a death sentence. Crops like wheat and barley struggled. Vineyards died out in England. In places like Scandinavia and Scotland, entire villages were abandoned when the soil stopped cooperating. People starved quietly, sometimes loudly, and because humanity loves a good scapegoat, they decided it couldn't possibly be the climate. No, someone had to be causing it. That's when Europe entered its most paranoid era yet, the witch hunt century, the Great Witch Panic. It's worth remembering that medieval Europe already believed in witches, but it wasn't until the late 1500s and early 1600s that things really escalated. Because when your crops die, your cows stop giving milk, and your neighbor's wife looks a bit too confident. Clearly, witchcraft is involved. Between 1560 and 1650, an estimated 50,000 people were executed for witchcraft across Europe. Most were women, though not all. Their crimes ranged from causing storms to making butter too fast. The irony? Many of the worst witch hunts happened in areas hit hardest by bad weather. Historians even call it the climatic witch craze. Essentially, crops failed, people panicked, someone blames a witch, local court lights a bonfire. And behind it all, you had the comforting presence of both Protestant and Catholic authorities saying, yes, definitely witches. Burn them all. Religious equality at last. Everyone agreed on something, even if that something was mass hysteria. Germany, ground zero for witch paranoia. No one did witch trials quite like the Holy Roman Empire, a messy patchwork of tiny German states, each competing to outdo the others in piety and paranoia. Take Würzburg and Bamberg in the 1620s. Both towns decided the best way to solve a series of bad harvests was to execute as many witches as possible. In Würzburg alone, about 900 people were killed in just a few years, including children, priests, and at least one mayor. Because once the trials started, nobody was safe. If you accused too few witches, you were suspiciously lenient. If you accused too many, you were probably a witch yourself. It was like the worst version of workplace politics imaginable. Meanwhile, the 30 Years' War was raging, a conflict so confusing that even historians can't always remember who was fighting whom at any given moment. The 30 Years' War, Europe's most exhausting meltdown. Let's take a gentle drift into the early 1600s. Imagine a map of Europe covered in smoke, confusion, and religious slogans. That's the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, an exhausting blend of Protestant versus Catholic, local versus imperial, and occasionally just, I hate my neighbor, let's burn his village. It started in Bohemia, when Protestant nobles threw two Catholic officials out of a window in Prague. That event, the defenestration of Prague, is remembered fondly by historians as both hilarious and tragic, mostly because the men survived by landing in a pile of manure. Symbolic, really, for the entire war that followed. The conflict dragged on for 3 decades, devastating Central Europe. Armies looted, burned, and ate everything in sight. Civilian casualties reached unimaginable levels. Some regions of Germany lost half their population. And again, the weather didn't help. Crops failed. Plagues spread. Villages that weren't burned by soldiers simply starved to death in the cold. One French general described the German countryside as a vast desert of ashes, which sounds poetic until you realize it was mostly accurate. Royal drama, the Bourbons and the Habsburgs. If you zoom out from the ruined fields of Germany, you'll find Europe's royal families continuing their favorite pastime, bickering over who was in charge. On one side, the Habsburgs, that famously inbred dynasty that ruled Austria and Spain, looking increasingly like a family portrait drawn from memory. On the other, the Bourbons of France, who had fewer chins but roughly the same ego. While peasants froze and starved, these families spent decades arguing about things like succession rights, Catholic orthodoxy, and who had the fanciest palace curtains. Speaking of palaces, this was also the century of Louis XIV, the Sun King. And yes, he's coming soon. But first, let's stop by England, where the weather wasn't the only thing giving people chills. England, a cold, damp melodrama. 17th century England was a damp soap opera featuring kings who didn't know when to quit and parliament members who didn't know when to stop arguing. The early 1600s were ruled by the Stuarts, starting with James I, the same James who commissioned the famous King James Bible and was mildly obsessed with witches himself. He even wrote a book called Demonology, which is exactly as fun as it sounds. In it, he argued that witches were real, dangerous, and probably living next door. So that's comforting. Then came his son, Charles I, who had the political instincts of a rock. He believed in the divine right of kings, which basically meant, God says I'm in charge, so don't question me. Unfortunately for him, Parliament disagreed, loudly, and after a decade of bad decisions, England descended into civil war. The English Civil War, all the fun of regicide. The 1640s were not great years to be English. Families divided, cities starved, and armies marched across the country looting as they went. Charles I managed to lose multiple wars and, eventually, his head, literally. He was executed in 1649 after being tried for treason against his own people, which was sort of revolutionary for the time. After that, England briefly tried the no king experiment under Oliver Cromwell, who turned out to be a deeply humorless man in a big hat. He banned theater, Christmas celebrations, and basically anything fun, which was very on brand for the Puritans. The weather during this time was particularly awful. Records show the Thames froze multiple winters in a row. Londoners held frost fairs on the ice, complete with markets, games, and ox roasts. It sounds festive, but remember, the only reason the river was frozen solid enough to party on was because it was that cold. Crops were failing again. People were hungry again. History was once again on repeat. Meanwhile in France, absolute monarchy hits its peak. While England was beheading its monarch, France decided to double down on the opposite idea. Enter Louis XIV, the self-styled Sun King, who ruled from 1643 to 1715, one of the longest reigns in European history. Louis XIV loved control. He centralized everything: politics, religion, fashion, even conversation. He built Versailles, the world's fanciest prison for nobles, where courtiers spent their days bowing, gossiping, and pretending the king's latest outfit was a religious experience. It worked for a while, but the cost was enormous. Wars, taxes, and constant palace extravagance drained the treasury. By the end of his reign, France was broke, starving, and quietly realizing that maybe absolute monarchy wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Oh, and the weather still sucked. Famine hit France repeatedly in the 1690s. One of them killed about 15% of the population. Louis XIV, naturally, blamed divine will while eating lavishly at Versailles. Across the north, Scandinavian misery. If you think France had it bad, let's glide up to Scandinavia, where bad harvest was practically an annual event. The Little Ice Age hit the north hardest. Norway's population stagnated. Iceland lost a quarter of its people to starvation. In Sweden, the 1690s were known simply as the Great Famine. The Baltic froze. Trade collapsed. In Iceland, livestock died en masse, and families survived by eating moss and dried fish, not ideal Michelin star material. And just when things started to warm slightly, Sweden decided to start a war. because apparently the only thing colder than the climate was common sense. Russia joins the party. Over in Russia, life was somehow even harder. Under the Tsars, peasants were basically property. And when the harvests failed, as they did often during the colder years, there was little recourse but prayer, vodka, and resignation. By the late 1600s, Peter the Great arrived, determined to modernize Russia by sheer force of will. He built St. Petersburg on a swamp, conscripted thousands to die building it, and forced nobles to shave their beards because he thought it looked more European. And while Peter was busy dragging Russia toward the 18th century, the climate continued to drag everyone else back toward the Stone Age. The global chill. The Little Ice Age wasn't just a European problem. China saw famines, droughts, and rebellions. The Ming dynasty collapsed partly because of crop failures and economic stress caused by cooling. In North America, harsh winters contributed to the struggles of early colonies like Jamestown and Plymouth, whose settlers, you might recall, were already starving before the climate got worse. There's even a story that during one bad winter, the Pilgrims resorted to boiling shoe leather for soup. So yes, across continents, humanity spent about 3 centuries being gently reminded that nature doesn't care about our feelings. Slowly, the world thaws. By the 18th century, the climate began to ease up a little. The frosts became less brutal, the harvests a little more reliable. Europe, after several centuries of collective suffering, started to stabilize. And yet, the scars of the Little Ice Age lingered, in folklore, in superstition, in the architecture of towns built close together to keep warm. It was a long, shivering memory of hunger, fire, and fear. But as the cold faded, a new kind of heat was rising, not from the sun, but from human ambition. The 18th and 19th centuries would bring revolutions, industrial smoke, and empires that stretched across the globe. In short, the world was warming up again, figuratively and soon literally. So let's take a slow, calm breath. And in the next part, we'll drift into another difficult chapter, the 18th and 19th centuries, when machines, monarchs, and revolutions made sure that being alive stayed just as stressful as ever. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we drift into the age of noise, the century when everyone decided that progress was worth a little smoke in the lungs. If the Middle Ages were all damp hay and candlelight, the 18th and 19th centuries were coal dust and gas lamps, churning endlessly toward what people back then optimistically called modernity. So settle in. The factory whistle will be sounding soon. Before the machines, the Enlightenment hangover. Let's start in the 1700s. Europe had just come out of its freezing phase, and everyone was feeling smug about reason and science. Philosophers gathered in Paris salons to discuss liberty, equality, and how unpleasant peasants looked when they were hungry. It was the so-called Age of Enlightenment, when humans believed they could think their way out of misery. And to be fair, some of them almost managed it. There were new ideas about government, rights, even hygiene. Unfortunately, the people most enthusiastic about liberty were rarely the ones doing manual labor. While Voltaire was writing witty letters, French farmers were paying about 80% of their income in taxes. Bread prices were rising, wages weren't, and let them eat cake was still a few years away from becoming the most famous thing someone didn't actually say. 2. The French Revolution. Equality, but make it bloody. By 1789, France had reached the kind of tension where even the bakers were muttering about overthrowing things. King Louis XVI, a mild, indecisive man whose main hobby was making locks, sat in Versailles trying to figure out why everyone was so angry. His wife, Marie Antoinette, had an equally sharp grasp of the situation. She kept ordering new dresses. Then the Estates General met, the Third Estate stormed out, and suddenly there were mobs waving pikes and shouting "Liberty" in the streets of Paris. It all escalated with suspicious speed. By July, the Bastille fell. By October, the royal family was being escorted back to Paris by a crowd armed with kitchen knives and moral certainty. The next decade was a blur of enthusiasm, paranoia, and headless nobles. The reign of terror turned liberty into an assembly line of executions. If you spoke too loudly, you were a traitor. If you stayed quiet, suspicious. The guillotine became the national sound effect. Even the revolution's leaders couldn't survive it. Robespierre, the man who said virtue must be combined with terror, eventually met his own blade. Paris smelled like fear and cheap wine, and the rest of Europe watched from a safe distance, clutching their monarchies like emotional support blankets. 3. Napoleon, Europe's shortest overachiever. Out of the chaos rose Napoleon Bonaparte, the one man who looked at Europe's smoldering ruins and thought, I could run this. Napoleon was clever, ruthless, and about 5.5 feet tall in his boots, so naturally he decided to conquer most of the continent. For a while, he succeeded. He crowned himself emperor because waiting for someone else to do it would have been too humble, reformed the legal code, modernized armies, and tried to export liberty via cannon. But conquering Europe is expensive, and winters in Russia don't care about your ambitions. In 1812, Napoleon marched 600,000 men into Russia. Fewer than 100,000 came back. Most froze, starved, or were eaten by horses, sometimes their own. By 1815, after Waterloo, Napoleon was exiled to the island of St. Helena, where he spent his days writing memoirs and regretting everything. Europe sighed in relief and immediately went back to arguing about borders. 4. Industrial Revolution. Progress with a cough. While France was busy perfecting the art of public execution, Britain had been quietly inventing the Industrial Revolution. It started innocently enough, spinning wheels, steam engines, textile mills. But soon every river in northern England was lined with factories puffing black clouds into the gray sky. Cities exploded overnight. Manchester, once a small town, became a sprawling maze of brick, soot, and child labor. The air was thick enough to chew. Chimneys turned the sunsets brown. Inside the mills, men, women, and children worked 14-hour shifts beside clattering machines that could remove a hand faster than you could say, workers' rights. Accidents were common, unions illegal, and holidays a myth. One observer described factory districts as a wilderness of bricks and smoke, populated by pale phantoms, which is a poetic way of saying everyone looked half dead. 5. The children of industry. If you were a child in the early 1800s, congratulations, you were cheap labor. Factories loved small hands, mines loved small bodies. Kids as young as 5 crawled under machines or hauled coal carts through tunnels barely 3 feet high. Some reformers eventually noticed this might be bad for morale. Parliament passed the Factory Act of 1833, limiting children under 9 from working in textile mills. Revolutionary stuff. Still, enforcement was spotty, and plenty of employers simply lied about ages. Victorian England liked to talk about moral virtue while employing orphans to clean chimneys. The cognitive dissonance was impressive. 6. Empire and hypocrisy. Meanwhile, Britain's industrial appetite demanded resources, and resources required colonies. So the British Empire expanded like a caffeine-addled octopus. India, the Caribbean, Africa, if it had land, labor, or spices, Britain wanted it. Colonial rule came wrapped in a vocabulary of civilization and progress, but the reality was taxation, famine, and forced labor. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed around 10 million people. Later famines in the 1800s did the same, often while grain was still being exported to Britain. At home, Britons sipped tea and congratulated themselves on global order. Abroad, millions paid for that order with their lives. The irony, of course, is that many Britons genuinely believed they were improving the world. Empire was marketed as a moral duty, a kind of sanctified capitalism. Even as factories in Manchester wove cotton picked by enslaved laborers, the rhetoric remained. Industry brings enlightenment. 7. Speaking of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade peaked in the 18th century. Over 12 million Africans were transported to the Americas. Millions more died en route. It's one of the darkest economic success stories in human history, and yes, European prosperity rode on it. Abolition took decades. Britain banned the trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833, though compensation went not to the freed people, but to the slave owners. Because of course it did. The newly industrialized nations proudly declared freedom while inventing wage labor systems that kept people conveniently poor and dependent. Progress, it turned out, had excellent branding. 8. Urban life. Smoke, gin, and cholera. Let's pause in Victorian London, circa 1850. Population, around 2.5 million. Sewage system, none worth mentioning. The Thames doubled as a drinking source and a waste dump. During the summer heat wave of 1858, the Great Stink, the smell from the river was so bad that Parliament soaked its curtains in lime. The only silver lining was that it finally convinced politicians to fund proper sewers. Diseases like cholera thrived. No one understood germs yet, so doctors blamed miasma, bad air. People tried carrying handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar, which did nothing except make them smell like salad. If you weren't dying of disease, you were probably dying of exhaustion. Tenement rooms packed entire families into spaces smaller than modern bathrooms. Infant mortality hovered around 150 per 1,000 births, a cheerful 15% success rate for staying alive. 9. Science and the sublime. To be fair, it wasn't all misery. The same era produced astonishing breakthroughs. Steamships crossed oceans. Trains connected continents. Darwin sailed to the Galapagos and accidentally started an existential crisis. But even scientific progress had its dark edges. Industrial chemistry brought dyes and pollution. Railroads brought speed and spectacular derailments. The telegraph shrank the world but spread bad news faster than ever before. People began to sense that the future was a machine with no brakes. Writers like Dickens, Blake, and later Marx chronicled the discontent in prose, poetry, and political pamphlets. The industrial city became both a marvel and a warning, a glimpse of human ingenuity and its cost. 10. Revolutions 2.0. The late 18th and early 19th centuries loved a good revolution. America tried one first in 1776, and against all odds, it worked. France tried again in 1789 and spent the next 100 years recovering. By 1848, the entire continent caught the fever. That year, uprisings erupted from Paris to Budapest. Students demanded constitutions, workers demanded wages, and monarchs demanded more coffee. Almost all the revolts failed, but they planted seeds of nationalism, socialism, and the idea that ordinary people might deserve political rights. And because governments hate learning, the next decades brought more of the same. Germany unified through war, Italy through chaos, and everyone else through mutual exhaustion. 11. The Irish famine. Hunger in an empire of plenty. From 1845 to 1849, Ireland endured what may be the bleakest episode of the century, the Great Famine. A potato blight wiped out the staple crop of the poor. The British government responded with indifference powered by economic theory. Over 1 million died of starvation and disease. Another 1 million emigrated. Meanwhile, food exports from Ireland continued, because contracts were sacred and peasants were not. The trauma reshaped Irish identity and scattered families across the Atlantic. For the empire that prided itself on moral superiority, it was a quiet, enduring shame. 12. Life expectancy and leisure, mostly the first one. By 1850, the average urban laborer in Britain could expect to live to about 35. That's if they weren't crushed by machinery or recruited into the army. Entertainment options were limited: gin, gossip, and public hangings. Newspapers described executions as family outings. Spectators cheered while pickpockets worked the crowd. Even so, small comforts existed. Penny dreadfuls, cheap novels, and music halls gave people a few hours' escape. Sleep, ironically, became a luxury. 6 hours a night between shifts counted as generous. 13. The Age of Empire 2.0. By the late 1800s, industrial powers had turned colonization into a science. The scramble for Africa carved entire continents with rulers and arrogance. Belgium's King Leopold II managed to make even other imperialists look squeamish with his atrocities in the Congo Free State. Millions died harvesting rubber for European bicycles. Maps were redrawn, borders ignored. Missionaries preached, soldiers conquered, bureaucrats taxed. And back home, newspapers celebrated the civilizing mission, conveniently skipping the part about forced labor and amputations. It's one of history's great paradoxes. The age of progress built on systematic exploitation. Steam engines roared. Human dignity took the train in the opposite direction. 14. The Victorians and their feelings. Let's peek again into Victorian households. Behind the lace curtains and moral sermons was a society obsessed with respectability, public virtue, private vice. Men worked themselves to death. Women were idealized as angels of the hearth while denied property rights. Medicine advised them to faint frequently. Fashion required corsets tight enough to rearrange ribs. Psychology didn't exist yet, so nervous breakdowns were called hysteria, treated with cold baths, or, if you were rich, spa vacations. It was an era where everyone pretended not to notice how miserable they were. 15. Industrial globalization. By 1880, telegraphs linked continents, steamships connected ports, and capitalism had become planetary. It sounds exciting until you remember that global trade mostly meant resource extraction for Europe and poverty for everyone else. China was forced open by the Opium Wars, India by the East India Company, Africa by Berlin Conference signatures. Each case followed the same script: unequal treaties, forced labor, local resistance, brutal suppression. The modern world was under construction, and no one had asked the tenants permission. 16. Urban dystopia in Technicolor. Cities kept growing: New York, London, Paris, Berlin. Electric lights appeared, followed swiftly by electrocutions. Factories ran day and night. The working poor lived by gaslight and debt. Soot coated everything. A white shirt turned gray in an hour. Lung diseases became so common that doctors called them simply the complaint. But there was also wonder, world fairs, photography, and early cinema. For a brief second, humanity glimpsed the future and thought it might be fun. Spoiler: it would be loud, hot, and occasionally revolutionary. 18. Science marches on, with mixed results. Medicine finally figured out germs in the mid-1800s. Doctors began washing hands. Mortality rates dropped, morale improved. Anesthesia arrived. Surgery stopped resembling medieval torture. But technology also birthed new nightmares. Machine guns, smokestacks, and soon, factories capable of producing war on an industrial scale. By 1900, humanity was technologically dazzling and spiritually exhausted. Summing up the smoke. If you were alive anywhere between 1750 and 1900, you lived through the loudest transformation in history. You might have seen electric lights for the first time, or lost a child to cholera. You could witness trains racing across landscapes while working 14 hours for a shilling. It was progress, yes, but progress with blisters. The industrial age lifted millions out of medieval poverty and dropped them neatly into urban squalor. And yet, somehow, people adapted. They built unions, libraries, public parks. They learned to demand better, inch by inch. 20. A quiet transition. As the 19th century slipped into the 20th, there was a strange hush, a feeling that something enormous was about to break. Empires were bloated, machines unstoppable, politics unstable. Everyone sensed it like static before a storm. But that storm, mechanized, global, and utterly modern, belongs to another night. For now, let's fade out amid the gas lamps and cobblestones, listening to the last whistle of the factory as it sighs into the dark. You can almost smell the coal smoke and ink, hear the slow turning of gears that never quite stopped. Hey again, everyone. Welcome back to another long, quiet descent through human history. If you're still awake, congratulations, you've already survived feudalism, plague, and the Industrial Revolution. Tonight, we wade into the 20th century, the century that promised flying cars, peace, and progress, then promptly exploded twice. So let's take a slow breath, pull the blanket up, and drift into the noise of the modern world. 1900, the world before the fall. At the turn of the century, people were genuinely excited about the future. Electric lights glowed in city streets. Phonographs played scratchy songs about love and empire. Queen Victoria was still hanging on, and the world seemed neatly divided between civilized powers and everyone else. There were automobiles, rare, expensive, and unreliable, puffing around like metal horses. Airplanes were an idea, antibiotics a dream. And the biggest health risk wasn't a virus or climate change. It was the factory next door. But underneath the confidence, the great powers were all quietly terrified of each other. It was like an over-decorated dinner party where everyone smiled and clutched a loaded revolver under the table. 2. The spark. A duke, a car, and a bad turn. In 1914, an Austrian Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, decided to visit Sarajevo. He was there to demonstrate the charm of imperial authority, which, predictably, went badly. A group of Serbian nationalists plotted to assassinate him. Most of them failed spectacularly. One threw a bomb that bounced off the car. But by pure cosmic incompetence, the Archduke's driver later took a wrong turn and stopped right in front of another assassin, Gavrilo Princip, who shot him. That one bad turn set off the most unnecessary chain reaction in human history. All the alliances clicked into place like dominoes made of nitroglycerin. Within weeks, the continent was at war. 3. World War I. Mud, gas, and pointless maps. No one expected the war to last. They said it would be over by Christmas. They didn't specify which Christmas, which turned out to be the issue. 4 years later, 16 million people were dead, most of them in muddy trenches stretching from Belgium to Switzerland. The weapons were modern, the tactics medieval. Generals ordered cavalry charges against machine guns because tradition. Trench life was a slow-motion nightmare. Mud up to the knees, lice in your clothes, rats the size of cats. Poison gas rolled across battlefields in ghostly clouds, and shell shock became the polite term for psychological collapse. Letters home were censored, optimism evaporated. By 1917, entire generations of young men were gone, replaced by rows of white crosses and the sound of artillery echoing through history. For home fronts and hollow victories. Civilians didn't escape either. Food shortages, rationing, propaganda posters. Your country needs you, though it never mentioned for what. Women entered factories to build the weapons that killed their brothers and husbands. For the first time, people realized that total war meant everyone was involved, whether they liked it or not. By 1918, the Central Powers collapsed. Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles, which blamed them for everything and billed them accordingly. The borders were redrawn by men in suits who had never visited most of the places they were dividing. It was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Instead, it became the prequel. 5. The Spanish flu. Because why stop suffering? As if 4 years of mechanized slaughter weren't enough, 1918 brought a pandemic. The Spanish flu infected about a third of the global population and killed up to 50 million people. It spread through soldiers returning home, through ships, trains, and crowded cities. People wore masks, schools closed, and conspiracy theories thrived. Sound familiar? Governments downplayed the crisis to avoid panic, which of course made it worse. In some towns, corpses piled faster than they could be buried. Doctors had no treatment except hope and aspirin. By 1920, the flu faded, leaving behind a generation already too numb to mourn properly. 6. The Roaring Twenties, jazz, gin, and denial. When the dying stopped, the dancing began. The 1920s were a global act of denial, a decade of glitter over grief. Cities buzzed with jazz clubs, flappers, and prohibition bootleggers. In America, fortunes grew on stock speculation. In Europe, recovery was more fragile, held together by loans and wishful thinking. Technology felt thrilling again. Radios, automobiles, movies. Everyone believed the future was finally back on track. Of course, it wasn't. The same decade that gave us Art Deco also gave us fascism. In Italy, Mussolini marched into power with theatrical hand gestures and mediocre ideas. Germany brewed resentment under economic collapse and humiliation. And America, the land of optimism, was quietly building the world's largest economic bubble. 7. 1929, the Great Depression. Then came October 1929. The stock market crashed, and suddenly, prosperity looked like a bad joke. Banks failed, factories closed, and unemployment reached record levels. In the US, people lost homes and savings overnight. In Germany, the economic collapse became the perfect storm for political extremism. Everywhere, governments panicked in slow motion. Soup kitchens, bread lines, dust bowls. It was a decade that turned ambition into survival. Even the word hope got repossessed. Rise of the monsters. While democracies floundered, dictators got busy. Mussolini strutted through Rome promising order. Stalin consolidated power in the Soviet Union, turning purges into a national sport. And in Germany, a failed artist with a toothbrush mustache decided he could fix everything. Adolf Hitler turned anger into ideology, promising to restore pride and prosperity, which he did, mostly through rearmament and propaganda. By 1939, Europe was once again a powder keg. Apparently, one world war just wasn't enough. 9. World War II, the loudest catastrophe. If World War I was pointless tragedy, World War II was deliberate horror. It started with the invasion of Poland in September 1939. Britain and France declared war, then waited several months before actually fighting, a period known, fittingly, as the Phony War. Then it all exploded. Germany stormed across Europe with terrifying efficiency. France collapsed in 6 weeks. Britain braced for invasion. The Blitz rained bombs nightly over London, while civilians slept in underground stations pretending the ceiling wouldn't fall in. 10. The Global Inferno. The war stretched across continents. In North Africa, tanks fought over sand and supply lines. In the Pacific, Japan expanded brutally across Asia, attacking Pearl Harbor in 1941 and pulling the United States into the conflict. Entire cities became targets. Wars were no longer fought between armies, they consumed civilians too. Warsaw, Stalingrad, Dresden, names turned into ashes. Behind the front lines, the Holocaust unfolded, industrialized genocide. 6 million Jews, along with countless others, murdered in camps designed for efficiency. Even now, history struggles to comprehend it without going numb. 11. The atomic end. By 1945, Germany was rubble, Japan cornered, and the Allies weary beyond measure. Then came the bombs. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, cities erased in seconds. Around 200,000 died instantly, many more in the years that followed. The war ended, but something darker began, the atomic age. Humanity had officially invented a weapon that could end everything, and no one quite knew how to feel about that. The peace celebrations were loud but uneasy. Half the world was destroyed, the other half was rebuilding under new rules. Poof, the Cold War, anxiety as a lifestyle. After 1945, the world divided into two large, heavily armed therapy sessions. The United States and the Soviet Union glared at each other across Europe, both convinced they were the good guys. Nuclear weapons piled up like existential dread. Children practiced duck and cover under school desks, as if it would stop radiation. Spies lurked, satellites launched, paranoia blossomed. The 1950s were all about containment, of communism, of emotion, of basically everything. America built suburbs, the USSR built walls. Everyone built bunkers. Meanwhile, the rest of the world. While superpowers glared, old empires finally cracked. India gained independence in 1947, followed by dozens of colonies across Africa and Asia. Decolonization was messy, hopeful, and often bloody. The dream of self-determination collided with Cold War politics. New nations caught between two superpowers offering aid that came with strings. It was progress, but of the uneasy kind. Porting, the 1960s. Hope, hair, and hysteria. The 1960s brought rebellion and color. Youth culture, civil rights, rock music. For a moment, optimism felt possible again. Humans even made it to space. First Yuri Gagarin, then Neil Armstrong walking on the moon in 1969. But underneath the peace signs and flower crowns, there was Vietnam, assassinations, and the growing realization that technology didn't equal morality. Television showed war in real time, and suddenly no one could unsee it. 1970s. Malaise with a soundtrack. The oil crisis hit, economies faltered, and disco tried to distract everyone. Dictatorships lingered in Latin America and the Middle East. Revolutions brewed quietly. It was a decade of inflation, pessimism, and polyester. People talked about the end of history, but history, as usual, wasn't listening. 1980s. Cold comforts and warm missiles. The 1980s looked shiny but felt brittle. Computers appeared, hair got bigger, and nuclear war hovered in the background like a bad smell. Reagan called the USSR an evil empire. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Everyone watched movies about nuclear winter and pretended they were fine. Then, in 1989, the impossible happened. The Berlin Wall fell. People cried, danced, and chipped it apart like a cursed relic finally breaking. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a confused sigh. 1990s. The brief illusion of peace. For a moment, the world exhaled. Communism seemed over, democracy triumphant, and capitalism victorious. The internet appeared, full of hope and dial-up noises. But war didn't disappear, it just moved. The Balkans burned, Rwanda bled, and new economies rose on old inequalities. Still, people called it the end of history, which was adorable in hindsight. The 21st century arrives, late and tired. Then came the new millennium. Everyone panicked about Y2K. Nothing happened. Then 9/11 did. The 2000s brought terrorism, endless wars, financial collapse, and the dawning realization that humanity had traded plague for burnout. Technology advanced faster than our ethics could keep up. Globalization connected everyone and comforted no one. And through it all, the same patterns echoed: progress shadowed by inequality, innovation haunted by its side effects. 19. The quiet misery of modernity. Today, the average person has more information than kings once did, and more anxiety than ever. We live longer, work harder, sleep less. Machines replace drudgery, but not despair. It's not the worst time to be alive materially, but mentally, we might be setting records. We scroll through history like voyeurs, fascinated by the past, vaguely aware that the future might be watching us with the same disbelief. 20. Full circle. Looking back across the centuries, famine, plague, revolutions, wars, and fluorescent office lighting, you start to notice a pattern. Every generation thought they were the peak of civilization. Every one of them was wrong. But maybe that's comforting. Maybe being alive has always been a little unbearable, and that's the point. We endure anyway. We build, destroy, rebuild, and occasionally learn something. So as you drift off tonight, remember, you're lying on the shoulders of survivors. People who walked through fire, famine, fallout, and still found time to invent coffee. Sleep well. You've earned it. Hey everyone. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've survived plague pits, guillotines, trench mud, and disco. Tonight, we arrive in the age of Wi-Fi and worry. The one time in history when you can summon the Library of Alexandria with a thumb and mostly use it to look at cat videos. This is the modern world. It's clean, loud, convenient, and quietly exhausting. So, take a breath. Let's glide gently through the last chapter, the time we call now. 1. A world that never sleeps. In the past, night used to mean quiet. Candles burned out, streets went dark, and people rested because there wasn't much else to do. But the world glows 24/7. The internet never turns off. News scrolls endlessly. Messages ping at 3 a.m. because someone in another time zone wants to know if you've seen this meme. We've created the first civilization in history that collectively forgot how to stop. And weirdly, we call it productivity. Work used to end when the factory bell rang. Now the factory lives in your pocket. Emails chase you into bed, and sleep schedules collapse under blue light. People talk about burnout like it's weather, inevitable, seasonal, mildly inconvenient. No one remembers what real rest feels like anymore. 2. The economy of attention. In the 21st century, the most valuable resource isn't oil or gold, it's focus. Everyone's trying to sell something, and what they're buying is your time. Every notification, every headline, every ad is a small tap on your skull whispering, "Look at me." It's capitalism's most efficient evolution, the economy of distraction. The irony, of course, is that it works. Humans are terrible at ignoring shiny things. Social media turned dopamine into currency and made boredom extinct. And yet, we've never felt so lonely. Millions scroll through curated lives, comparing, consuming, feeling somehow less. The more connected we get, the more isolated it feels. It's like standing in a crowded room where everyone's shouting and no one's listening. 3. Work, now with extra existentialism. Let's talk about jobs. Remember the Industrial Revolution? Long hours, low pay, dangerous machines? Well, we fixed 2 of those. Mostly. Modern workers don't lose limbs to machinery. They lose their sense of self to spreadsheets. The tools changed, but the exhaustion stayed. We call it the grind, which sounds noble until you realize it's exactly what millstones do to grain. Even creative jobs became metrics: engagement, reach, growth. Your hobby now comes with analytics. Every passion is a potential side hustle. And quiet quitting isn't rebellion, it's self-preservation. For cities of glass and noise, the modern city sparkles. Skyscrapers, subways, coffee chains, progress on display. But if you stand still long enough, you notice the hum: engines, traffic, air conditioners, constant motion. There's no silence left. Even in the countryside, drones buzz, highways echo, and somewhere a delivery van never stops moving. We built environments that reject calm. Green space became luxury, sunlight became optional. We call it urban life, the human terrarium. 5. Climate, the slow disaster. Now about the planet. It's not doing great. The Industrial Revolution's smoke never really cleared. It just got fancier. Cars, factories, power plants. Progress had a side effect, and now it's melting the poles. Climate change is the first apocalypse with a PowerPoint presentation. Everyone knows it's happening. No one can agree what to do. Governments hold conferences that produce heartfelt speeches and vague promises. Meanwhile, summers keep getting hotter, floods higher, forests smaller. Whole cities now plan for managed retreat, which is a polite way of saying we'll move when it sinks. For anyone wondering what it feels like to live through the fall of Rome, this is probably it, just with better Wi-Fi. 6. The age of anxiety. Every century had its favorite emotion. The medievals had fear, the Victorians had repression. We got anxiety. It's the perfect modern disease, invisible, constant, and hard to treat without logging off. We carry tiny portals of stress everywhere. Every message, every update, every breaking news alert is a microdose of panic. Therapists are fully booked. Meditation apps have push notifications. Even relaxation became a product. You can buy a subscription to calm down. Capitalism's final punchline. 7. Politics, now streaming in 4K. Democracy in the digital age feels like an ongoing reality show. Every scandal live-streamed, every debate a meme within hours. We used to have pamphlets in town squares. Now we have comment sections, the new public arena where nuance goes to die. Misinformation spreads faster than truth because it's simply more entertaining. And outrage, as it turns out, is addictive. We refresh the chaos daily just to feel alive. Empires once collapsed under swords and famine. Ours might go out arguing online. 8. The surveillance era. Once upon a time, only gods and kings could watch everything you did. Now it's your phone. Cameras on every corner, algorithms tracking clicks, smart assistants listening for your convenience. We volunteered for the panopticon because it came with free shipping. Privacy became nostalgia, something your grandparents had, like photo albums or attention spans. Every purchase, every scroll, every pause in front of an ad feeds the machine. We're all data now, politely monetized. And the weirdest part? Most people have stopped caring. Health or something like it. Medicine works miracles now. We can transplant organs, edit genes, cure diseases that once wiped out continents. But somehow, everyone's still tired. Modern health is a paradox. Bodies live longer, minds wear out sooner. We fight invisible enemies, stress, loneliness, burnout, with vitamins and podcasts. Even food turned complicated. Half the world eats too much, the other half not enough, and everyone argues about carbs. We cured plague, but not panic. We conquered death in the statistical sense and replaced it with chronic unease. 10. Technology's strange mirror. Every invention solves a problem and invents a new one. The internet gave us knowledge and also conspiracy theories. Social media gave us communication and also the urge to perform existence for strangers. Artificial intelligence arrived promising convenience, and quietly took most creative jobs with it. Machines learned to write, draw, compose, and pretend to empathize. Humans started wondering what's left for them to do. The future, once thrilling, now feels suspiciously crowded. 11. The cult of productivity. Somewhere along the way, people decided worth equals output. Rest became laziness. Hobbies became monetized. There are entire industries built on optimizing life. Planners, apps, courses, all to squeeze more from the same 24 hours. And still, no one feels caught up. Even leisure became performance. Vacation photos curated, workouts tracked, sleep analyzed. You can't just be, you must document being. It's progress by exhaustion. 12. The illusion of choice. We live in a world of options, thousands of shows, brands, opinions. It feels like freedom, but really it's paralysis with better packaging. Every decision is tiny stress. Which phone plan, which news source, which identity today? The paradox of abundance, everything available, nothing's satisfying. It's no wonder minimalism became trendy. People started throwing away possessions just to feel something again. 13. Globalization. Everyone, everywhere, overwhelmed. The modern world is connected, beautifully, dangerously. A protest in one city trends worldwide. A supply chain glitch on another continent empties shelves. It's efficient, but fragile. We built an economy like a spider web, strong when intact, disastrous when torn. The pandemic showed that clearly. One cough in one market, and suddenly the entire planet was baking sourdough at home. Globalization made us neighbors, but not necessarily friends. 14. The pandemic years. Speaking of that, 2020 arrived like a bad sequel, global lockdowns, masks, empty streets. It was the first truly shared human experience in centuries, and no one enjoyed it. For a brief moment, skies cleared, wildlife returned, people clapped for nurses from balconies. Then the boredom set in. We baked bread, learned TikTok dances, and realized how fragile normal really was. It wasn't the Black Death, but the loneliness hit harder. The enemy was invisible, the rules confusing, the hope inconsistent. When it ended, or pretended to, we rushed back to normal like nothing happened. But something cracked quietly, and it hasn't healed. 15. Generations of fatigue. Every generation thinks the next one is doomed. But modern youth might actually be right. They inherit debt, climate chaos, digital surveillance, and the vague instruction to follow your passion. They were raised online, fluent in irony, and allergic to optimism. Yet somehow they still keep going. It's impressive, really, surviving collapse while making memes about it. 16. The digital afterlife. Even death changed. Profiles linger, messages stay, voices live on in servers. We used to fade into memory, now we're cached indefinitely. There's comfort in that, maybe. A kind of immortality by algorithm. But it also means ghosts now have Wi-Fi. The past no longer disappears, it updates itself. 17. The myth of progress. The story of civilization always had one theme: improvement. Better tools, better lives, better futures. But maybe progress isn't a straight line. We traded hunger for stress, darkness for insomnia, superstition for disinformation. We conquered distance but lost attention. Humanity keeps upgrading its environment while forgetting to update itself. Quiet hope against all logic. And yet, people still love. They plant gardens, rescue animals, write poetry no one reads. Communities form, rebuild, forgive. Even amid chaos, humans persist in making meaning. It's messy and small and defiant. That's the part history forgets to mention, not the empires, but the everyday survival. Progress may falter, but kindness keeps sneaking through. 19. Looking back, looking forward. We've wandered through thousands of years together tonight. Famine, fire, and factory smoke. And somehow, here we are, still arguing on the internet about pineapple on pizza. That's the real miracle, endurance through absurdity. The worst times to be alive were never just about suffering, they were about adaptation. People found humor in horror, beauty in ruin, purpose in chaos. Maybe the best we can do is the same. 20, the end, or maybe just another beginning. So, as we drift out of this long story, out of the noise and glow of the 21st century, remember, history doesn't stop. It just changes costumes. The next catastrophe will have better branding, the next renaissance worse Wi-Fi. And through it all, people will still tell stories, still chase meaning, still hope for a quieter tomorrow. So close your eyes. Let the centuries blur together. The plagues, the kings, the revolutions, the tweets. It's all the same human heartbeat echoing softly through time. Good night, traveler. You've made it to the end of history, or at least tonight's version of it.